Welcome everyone to this guided practice session presented by the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne. I'm Dr. Chris McCaw and I'm Education Lead at the Centre. Now, to begin with, we respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. Pay respects to elders past, present and future, and in any Indigenous people present today. I also want to remind all participants in this webinar that your well-being is our highest concern, and by joining this session, you do so in compliance with the Centre for Contemplative Studies Centre terms and conditions that, as you indicated when registering online. So just see the chat for more information, but if you're unwilling or unable to comply with the terms and conditions, we respectfully ask that you please leave the session now. But we are really delighted to welcome back Professor Matthew Sharpe to facilitate this guided meditation series in the Stoic tradition. Matthew is the National Head of School of Philosophy at the Australian Catholic University, and he has written and taught extensively about Stoicism and philosophy as a way of life in the ancient tradition. As we go through, if you have any questions, comments, or reflections, please place them in the Q&A at any point during the session, and we'll address as many as possible towards the end. And also don't hesitate to hit those reactions too as we go through. But look, welcome, Matthew, and I'm just going to pass over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you to the Centre. I can only see a black screen with contemplative studies on it, but welcome everybody. As Chris has indicated, if there are ways of just interacting in terms of what Zoom allows, please do consider interacting in those ways, and also there will be question time when we're finished. So this is the first of 5 sessions. My name, as Chris has said, is Matthew. I am a Professor of Philosophy at ACU, and as Chris has also indicated, I've really been reading and working in different ways on the Stoics and Stoicism as a philosophical way of life since probably 2008, 2009 in different ways. So it's something that's very close to me, and it's great to be able to have the opportunity to share it, particularly in a context which doesn't just involve academic teaching, but at the end of each session, we'll look to do about a 15-minute meditation, a guided meditation, which will be followed by questions and answers. And last year, several members of the group formed into a continuing little practice community, and we kept at it for some time afterwards. Okay, so let me introduce Stoicism for those of you who aren't familiar with it. I'm aware in introducing the philosophy that it has attained to an extraordinary popularity, which is probably, certainly by me, unthought of as possible as recently as maybe 15, 16 years ago through the internet. And that's obviously both a very good thing in many ways, but it also does bring the possibility that a lot of the material that is out there under the name of Stoicism often is pretty selective and arguably doesn't do a complete or thorough job with the material and can push it into alignment with other ideologies that are out there. So Stoicism was an ancient Greek philosophy from the Hellenistic period, which was then taken up amongst the educated Roman classes in the period of the end of the Republic and the Imperium, around the time of the birth and life of Jesus of Nazareth. It was founded in the 4th century BCE, and then there are 3 famous leads or scholarchs of the school, namely Zeno, Cleanthes, that should be, and Chrysippus, the latter of whom wrote an extraordinary amount of books that are mentioned by other sources, but unfortunately they're all gone except in extracts. So as I've mentioned, it becomes prominent around the 1st century BCE and 2nd century BCE, and the texts that we have surviving from antiquity are from this period, and they're from the Roman Stoics, led by, I guess, the kind of big 3 that you'll see people working with, particularly if you encounter Stoicism in one or other online setting, namely Seneca. He was 1st century of the Common Era, sometime tutor of Emperor Nero, eventually asked by Nero to take his own life. Epictetus, who comes a generation later, um, he's a freed slave he was crippled by the brutality of his master. He was emancipated or manumitted and went to Greece and founded his own school. And in his wake, we get Marcus Aurelius and the Meditations. So, some quick comments on what it means to talk about meditation in the context of Stoicism. So, Stoicism is a philosophy for life. It's not a philosophy for academics. It primarily aims at therapy and at enabling people to live fuller, better lives. So, one image out there is, of course, that Stoicism is all very grim and joyless. It's a philosophy of happiness. It's understanding of of what makes happiness possible is just a little bit different than what we're going to get in a lot of other places in our culture. So it's a philosophy for life. It's to be practiced as well as thought. It accepts the Socratic insight from Socrates, that is, that philosophy is a business of taking care of the soul. So that's what Socrates said when he was put on trial by the Athenians. He was asked to explain what he was up to, and he said that philosophy is care of the soul. Stoics believe that people suffer avoidably because of the ways that we perceive, think, and act in the world, not just on account of what happens to us from the outside. This is a core claim that the Stoics make. We suffer avoidably, so we can avoid this suffering if we change how we perceive, think, and act. To do that will be to cultivate different kinds of virtues or strengths of character, moderating impulses, courage under fire, justice to others, and wisdom, which governs, if you like, all of our actions and interactions. And the Stoics believe that if a person develops these four cardinal virtues, then they will be flourishing. They will tend to flourish. And this will be relatively independently of how much external stuff they may have or acquire, whether they are well known or live a life of being unknown. Anyone from any walk of life who cultivates these virtues will be a flourishing human being, according to the Stoics. And because they're flourishing, they will also be serene or tranquil and joyful. So the Stoics describe how the sage, the perfected figure of wisdom, will be serene. Their inner life will be calm and balanced. And also they will be joyful. They will be cheerful. They will be welcoming and generous to others. And they won't have those kind of crippling negative affects, emotions that most of us have at one point or another. However, if that's the good news. The more difficult news is that this doesn't come for free. To flourish, they believe we need to take care of ourselves. We need to pay attention to ourselves, which is what we'll be talking about today. We need to attend to and think through and undertake certain practices upon what we say, do, think, and believe. So that's the framework in which a text like It Takes Practice, Habit Building, ascesis. That's the framework in which a text like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which of course directly speaks to what we're doing here, takes place. So Stoic meditation, as we'll see, is not really about clearing the mind of all thought, as per some forms of Buddhist practice, not all. The meditations themselves, the texts, which you can get in most bookshops these days or online, and there are a growing number of translations as Stoicism continues to become popular. They are written by Marcus Aurelius for himself. They were clearly not meant for publication. They were found amongst his mortal remains. There was no intention to publish that we're aware of. They were written by himself for himself. So in that sense, like a diary, but different from a diary in some ways. The meditations, as you'll see when you read them, you won't find an awful lot about Marcus's most intimate feelings, except in general terms. There's no names are dropped of people with whom he's interacting, although it's clear that there are some people he's interacting with that are difficult people. He's not about expressing, taking what's inside and pouring it out. It's more the opposite. He's trying to bring in and recall to mind thoughts and principles about life and how to live from Stoic philosophy. So meditation is um, chewing over, repeatedly, thinking deeply through, formulating and reformulating principles that a person has taken to be true, to be helpful, to be conducive to a better life. And when we meditate upon these principles, we are trying to deeply internalize them. So one metaphor that you'll find in some Stoic texts is it's like dyeing a cloth. You want to dye the cloth of your soul with these principles if you think that they are true. If you read the Stoic ideas and you think, hey, well, look, it looks as though they got it right, they have a really good philosophy of life, that won't get you very far unless you undertake the practices of deeply internalizing them, including forms of meditation. Um, so the aim, as I said before, is to attain serenity, to be prepared to try to speak and act well, thoughtfully, philosophically in the world. So that's what Stoic meditation is about, and we'll be doing some meditation with some adapted breath work as well in the weeks to come. Speaking of the weeks to come, today we're going to talk about what Epictetus, that second of the three Roman Stoics I mentioned before, argues is the most important thing to build a good Stoic practice, which is this idea of cultivating what they call prosophe or attention. Next week, as against last year, I'm going to this is kind of in response to some feedback last year. I think it's important to have a look at how Stoicism situates us vis-a-vis other people, because some of the online presentations and if you approach Stoicism in certain ways, it can lead to the idea that Stoicism is all about kind of number one. It's practices of self-care in isolation or even potential hostility to other people. So I think next week, in contrast to last year, I want to kind of go straight to what I think is very true, which will counteract those images of Stoicism. We'll look at Stoic practices for responding to insults, so the kinds of difficult situations that we can find ourselves in around others, and the way that Stoicism is actually a cosmopolitan philosophy. It is a race blind, religion blind, creed blind, tradition blind philosophy that upholds that all human beings, insofar as they're able to speak, are fundamentally of dignity and worthy of our respect. And that is something that does drop out of some online packagings of Stoicism for particular markets. Week three, we'll look at the fundamental Stoic principle of the dichotomy of control. Week four, we'll look at the idea of premeditation of adversity. And then week five, kind of circling back in a way to week two, we'll look at some of the Stoic exercises for connection. So week two, we'll look at connection to others. In week five, we'll look at some of the Stoic practices which are about connecting to the wider cosmos. And one of those practices has been named the view from above. So that's the program of the next 5 weeks. Each class will involve sort of 10 to 20 minutes of me talking and giving you the kind of the theory that will then inform practice, and then there'll be Q&A. And that's the format, and that's the plan. So, without further ado, let's launch into this idea of understanding and cultivating Stoic attention. Let's start where we are in this extraordinary time. We're in a time where we are exposed to more information than any other generation until probably the next one coming. We have access to screens and different modes of interactive information provision that were undreamt of 3 generations ago. In this environment, of course, advertisers are being paid to capture our attention all the time. Social media algorithms are feeding people information in order to try to capture their attention and to keep them on the platforms, liking, sharing, looking at adverts, potentially purchasing. Then that data is on-sold to third parties who can use it to target their advertising on the platforms, and so it goes. So we've got more information to us now than any generation previously, and it seems to be only growing. So Chris Hayes's book, The Siren's Call, I would recommend if you're interested in looking at this. Hayes does some of the history, and he argues that attention is now the most precious commodity in the present day marketplace. It's kind of what drives the economy. So to gather your attention, the algorithms have worked out statistically these emotions are the best: lust, shock and surprise, outrage, and anger. So what this would mean from a Stoic perspective, and I imagine also from a Buddhist perspective, is that social media is really not very good for our mental health, because a life full of these powerful affects, an inner life, is not anything like that of somebody who has attained to anything like wisdom or serenity. It's a life of inner turmoil, being shocked and awed, outraged and angered. So these emotions are unpleasant, and indulged to excess, they become sources of suffering, according to the Stoic perspective. So you're probably familiar with the literature which is growing on the effects of these technologies on our communities, and particularly on the young. So Jonathan Haidt's books had an effect in Australia, The Anxious Generation. Some of the data there has been contested, but the legislation that's been passed now to limit social media exposure is based on this kind of research. So that's where we are. So our attention is being solicited, it's being commodified, it's being on-sold, it's being titillated constantly, it's being distracted, pop-ups on the side, ads in between the text, everything like that. So the Stoics argue, particularly the Roman Stoic Epictetus, that the fundamental thing that we should be trying to cultivate is a kind of continuous vigilance and presence of mind, a self-consciousness which never sleeps, and a constant tension of the spirit. Thanks to this attitude, the philosopher will be fully aware of what they do at each instant and will their actions fully. Thanks to that spiritual vigilance, the Stoic always has at hand, prochiron, the fundamental rules of life. That is the distinction between what depends upon us and what doesn't. A fundamental attitude of continuous attention, which means constant tension and consciousness, as well as vigilance exercised at every moment. So this is what Pierre Hadot, who's a very eminent scholar in this field, has argued is basic to Stoicism, a certain kind of paying attention to the world and oneself. Let's have a talk about what that might mean and look like, and see if we can get that clear. So here's Epictetus. For as Socrates said, we ought not to live a life without examination. So we ought not to accept any appearance without examination. So what's an appearance? An appearance is anything we perceive, anything we perceive. So we perceive through our eyes, through our ears, through our skin, through our nose. And our mind is solicited by these appearances. And we're asked to, we're effectively, in an ongoing process of forming responses to those appearances. So we ought not to accept an appearance without examining it. And we should say, wait, let me see what you are, and whence do you come? Like the watchman at night, show me the path. So somebody at the gate of a medieval fort, who are you? Will I let you in or not? Have you the signal from nature which the appearance that may be accepted ought to have? So there's this idea that it's very important that we don't just respond thoughtlessly and, if you like, reactively to what appears to us, the situations we find ourselves in. The Stoics are going to try to introduce a kind of conscious awareness into this process of responding to the world, which involves taking care for the proper use of appearances. That is, according to the Stoics, discerning between what is true and what is false, and what actions are appropriate and not appropriate. That would be the proper use of appearances. Whereas often, of course, we can just kind of react to something that happens more or less thoughtlessly, and often badly. So yeah, impressions are what we perceive about the outside world, and they also involve the kind of inner impressions that constitute the basis of our emotional life. So you see somebody acting badly, and you'll probably have a set of impulses to respond with disapproval. And depending on what the action is, there might also be impulses which involve potential distress, for example. So our mind, as we'll talk about it as we go, for the Stoics, we're between external impressions and our internal impulses. And in between, there is the capacity for choice. In between, there is the capacity for reflection. In between is the capacity for choice. Often we become prey to the idea that what happens outside us, in a sense, determines us to react in a certain way, or what another person says about us, for example, might determine that we have to feel a certain way about that. And the Stoics are going to ask us to reflect on whether that's always the case. So the basic idea is simple. The soul is more important than the body, but people almost always pay attention to certain bodily activities. For example, when you're walking, that you don't trip over. But what if in mental life there are rocks on the path as well? What if those rocks are bad passions, disruptive passions, negative feelings, hostility to impulses of hostility towards others? What if they're the rocks on our mental path? Why don't we pay as much attention to them as every person does when they're going for a walk, to be careful not to step on a nail? Well, the Stoics think we should. As the soul is more important than the body, the soul is the capacity to think, make decisions, and to live. So also, according to the Stoics, we ought to pay attention to these potential obstacles. Our soul can form thoughts which distress us needlessly. We often suffer more in imagination than we need to do in reality, according to a famous quote by Seneca, the first Stoic I mentioned, from the Roman period. We tend to take as more real what we can bang into, the physical things, and pay less attention to what is going on in our inner life, the Stoics argue, and this is a source of avoidable distress. So, what should we pay attention to? We're nearly at the point of starting to do a meditation. Well, rarely is a person seen, says Marcus Aurelius, to be in a bad way because he's failed to attend to what is happening in someone else's head. But those who fail to pay careful attention to what's going on in their own soul are bound to be in a wretched state. So it's clearly not the case that we need to be paying attention to what every person who we might possibly meet or not is saying on social media, for example. That's not the kind of attention that we mean. Firstly, I'll give three objects of attention according to the Stoics if we want to make improvement. First of all, we are going to try to focus our attention on what is presently at hand and what we can act and intervene upon. We'll see later as we go that this is associated with the idea of a dichotomy of control, the need to distinguish between what we can do and what happens to us and what others can do. So Marcus Aurelius says, meditation 754, everywhere and at all the time it lies within your power to be reverently contented with your present situation, to behave justly to such people as are presently with you, and to deal skillfully with your present impressions, so that nothing may steal into your mind which you have not adequately grasped. So these are things we can do. And the Stoics are saying these are the things we ought to be paying attention to. We can become content with where we are. We can deal justly with the people who are around us. And we can learn to be aware of the kinds of thoughts that we're having, and to critically assess them. For example, some of them may be based on false or problematic ideas of one kind or another. So that's firstly. So let's pay attention to what is at hand, where we are, who we're with, and what we are doing, including what we are thinking. Secondly, and this relates to others in particular, particularly Epictetus in his discourse on attention, which is Discourses 4:12, which has the title On Attention. He asks, what should we pay attention to? And he says, first, these general principles. So that idea of meditation upon principles, that nobody is master of another person's inner life, and that in this sphere alone of what we ourselves think and do, um, this is where we're going to find a person's good and evil, according to the Stoics. And that means they're suffering and or non-suffering. They're flourishing or non-flourishing. It follows, therefore, that no one has the power either to procure me good or to involve me in evil, but I myself alone have authority over myself in these matters. So we'll talk about this next week. We can often think that if others think badly of us, because we do have social impulses and we want to be, it's human to want to be liked. That if others don't like us, that this causes forms of mental distress. And the Stoics are going to say, well, it's not preferable that others don't like you, but it is possible because what they do and think is unfortunately, or fortunately, it's just the way that it is. It's not in our control. Um, so what we can do about that situation is monitor how we respond, and how we represent ourselves. Three, accepting where and who you are. All these things at which you wish to arrive by a circuitous road you can have right now if you do not refuse them to yourself, Marcus Aurelius says. And this means if you take no notice of all the past, trust the future to providence and direct the present conformably to piety and justice. Now, piety in the Stoic context means something in more secular language, something like acceptance. So if we put the past behind us, if we let the future wait, and if we attend to what is present, we're going to go better, according to the Stoics, and we'll be practicing what they mean by prosecute attention. So that's the end of the first theoretical installment. I see we have about 10 minutes to do a meditation, to finish at 1:40, and then we're going to have 5 minutes of question time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now turn my slides off, and I'm going to ask you, wherever you find yourself, standing, sitting, or lying, if you can find a place of quiet, please do. And in a moment, we're going to we'll go into a breathing meditation, and then we'll look at, or I'll present to you one of Marcus Aurelius's meditations as the theme of the meditation. So it's 1:30, so I'm going to put my alarm on for 1:40, and we will commence. All right, so if you are more comfortable, please shut your eyes. What we're going to start by doing is just gently paying attention to our breathing and slowly inhaling and exhaling. Try to consciously slow the pace of your breathing. There's no need to strain, but just slow the pace. You may wish to just mentally say in when you're breathing in and out when you're breathing out. The air that you breathe in might feel a little colder, and as you breathe out, a little warmer. We've been talking about attention. So what I want you to do now is try to consciously, without forcing, gently, just direct your attention to the soles of your feet. They may be in the air, they may be on the ground. I just want you to pay attention to what the soles of your feet, the impressions that they're giving you. You might try to consciously relax your feet as you feel those sensations. Now see if you can draw your attention to between your toes. Don't have to move your toes. What can you feel between your toes? Can you let your attention rest there? Now see if you can redirect your attention to your navel, basically your belly button. And again, just let your attention rest on whatever sensations are there. As you breathe in and out. Finally, before we do the Stoic text, to see if you can draw your attention now up to your eyes, which may be closed, they may be open. But see if you can just consciously relax your eyelids, consciously relax your eyes. So here's the Marcus Aurelius text. There are three things of which you are composed: your body, your vital breath, which we've been focusing on, and your mind. Now, if you can separate from yourself, that is to say, from your thought, everything that others may be saying or doing, or again, everything that you yourself have said and done in the past, as well as the things which trouble you because they are still to come, and everything that happens to you independently of your choice, because of the body which surrounds you, and everything which stirs the waves of the violent sea which bathes you. If I say you separate from this guiding part of yourself the things which have become attached to it because it has become attached to them, and if you separate in time that which is beyond the present and that which is past, so you make yourself like the sphere of Empedocles, a pure orb, proud in its joyful uniqueness. And if you strive to live only what you do live, that is to say, the present, then you will be able to live the time left to you, untroubled, benevolent, and serene with regards to your inner self. As you will have heard, we've arrived at the end of the meditation, so please take the time now to take a couple of final breaths. Open your eyes, reconnect with your surrounds. You may want to stretch, you may want to have a little shimmy or a shake to reactivate parts of you that have been resting. That is the end of my component of today's class. I hand over to Chris and to questions.
All right. Thanks so much for that, for Matthew. So that's right. It's time. If there's anything you're curious about, any questions you have, please post into our Q&A. I can see a couple of things coming up and a lot of love there as well. Fantastic. So we do have a couple of minutes. So let us move to Lisa's question. Matthew, how would you lessen the anxiety from the world news?
That's a great question, Lisa. I know exactly what you mean. It's getting harder and harder to stay tuned, isn't it? Look, I mean, I think at some level, budgeting your attention is something that we can practice. I think it's important to be informed because so many of the things that are happening are so important to so many people and potentially soon enough, I think, to Australia as well. But on the other hand, there's a passage in Seneca where he says that if a person was to get angry about everything that human beings do wrong to each other, they would their head would explode from anger. So we need to be able to, um, I think, go to reliable sources and to keep informed without, I guess, indulging in the possibility of kind of doom scrolling, if you like, through the litany of increasingly disordered events that seem to be upon us. Um, I wish I could be more optimistic about those events, but at present, I'm cautious, let's say.
Um, yeah, I think there's certainly something there linking back to your comments about the sort of attention economies and finding places where you can get that information where it's not wrapped in all the outrage
It's
and
also not
wrapped.
sensationalized.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's probably harder and harder to maybe find that as well. Look, there's a few more coming. I think a really interesting question that you could spend a couple of minutes on is this question: are Stoicism and activism incompatible? So it's this question about the active life or political action.
Yeah. The Stoic idea is, as we'll see next week, the core idea is that we are members of the human community and that what happens in the human community matters to us as human beings. The Epicureans argue that we should withdraw from the world, particularly in troubled times. The Stoics tend to argue that we should try to engage. It's just that we need to be aware of the dangers of engaging, obviously the external dangers, but that there are also psychological dangers that can come with engaging in terms of uh, if we want to defend a cause, which we ought to. There will be people who oppose us. There will be challenges. There will be, in this day and age, online discourse of various kinds, often involving insult and abuse. So, I mean, the way I tend to think about it is that Stoicism can come along for the ride, if you like, and come along in that process because it is meant to be a philosophy which enables a person to stay calmer in the face of adversity than otherwise. Every life is going to have adversity, and certainly a political activist or somebody who's involved in trying to change the world is probably going to face opposition. And so it's a good idea to have strategies to try to do that with as much internal strength as you can. And that's where I would see Stoicism fitting into that picture.
Yeah, what I take from that as your first comment is certainly not a philosophy of withdrawal from sort of public life at all.
No, they explicitly argue that you should only really withdraw as a last resort, you know. There will be some circumstances, under, for example, a tyrant where there's just nothing you can feasibly do without immediately endangering yourself or your family. One thinks of certain news items. And in those situations, then it becomes excusable to withdraw, but it is kind of it's not the best option, if you like, as far as the
Yeah.
Stoics are concerned.
So I want to acknowledge there are a growing list of really fantastic questions. What we'll do, I'll close the session now, but what we'll do is record those, and Matthew will have a chance to consider those and potentially write or speak to them in future
Yeah,
weeks.
if you
So
could get them to me by email, I think we did that last year.
yeah,
Yep.
thanks so much for those comments and questions. And these themes will no doubt keep coming up. So thank you and keep those questions coming. But look, thanks again for facilitating today's fantastic session, our starting session for this series. Thanks to all the audience for joining us. We really hope to see you again for the remainder of the series. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.